I'm Brianna Keeler, live from CNN's Washington headquarters. Underway right now, a president legally exposed, his former fixer implicating President Trump in several crimes, while one lawmaker warns there's another shoe to drop. Plus, turns out the Republican at the center of the emotional standoff over race during that hearing has a history of birtherism. And he came, he saw, he left. The president walks away from nuclear talks with Kim Jong-un without a deal. And an American citizen died after being detained in a North Korean prison, and yet President Trump gives cover for the despot in charge. And Michael Cohen is back in the hot seat on Capitol Hill as we speak, a day after dropping bombshell after bombshell in an open hearing. The president's former personal attorney is testifying in front of the House Intelligence Committee behind closed doors. CNN's Manu Raju is on Capitol Hill. And Manu, this is Michael Cohen's third straight day testifying. What are you hearing about today's testimony and the fallout from his public appearance yesterday?
Yeah, he's been in there since about 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. We expect this to go on for most of the day today. He's been there focusing in large part about the false statements that he previously gave this same committee back in 2017 about that Trump Tower Moscow project, the Trump organization's pursuit of that project, the president's involvement, and why those statements were where he initially lied to the committee. That'll be a big focus going forward, as well as what he said yesterday about Roger Stone telling the president about his alleged efforts to reach out to WikiLeaks in advance of that data dump that hurt the Clinton campaign. They're going to expect to hear more about that. But Republicans already going after Cohen's testimony, saying that he perjured himself on several accounts. Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, two of President Trump's closest allies, just sent a letter to the Attorney General referring him for possible criminal prosecution over several statements that he made. They say they were contradicting, including whether he was pursuing a White House job, which he said he was not. They're saying that is not true based on the evidence that prosecutors have uncovered. They also said that he committed bank fraud, even though he said he did not defraud any bank. He did plead guilty to making false statements to a bank, but not bank fraud. Those are several other issues as well that they're pushing ahead. But Brianna, lawmakers are planning to investigate a whole slew of matters that came out of yesterday's testimony. Elijah Cummings, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, told me just moments ago that probably a big focus of his committee going forward will be the president's role while in office over those hush money payments to silence those Trump affairs right before the 2016 elections. And he expects all the other crimes that were alleged to be investigated by various committees. They're going to sort out all of that in the days and weeks ahead. So not over yet, today's testimony, the final on Capitol Hill, but a lot more for these lawmakers to follow up on. Brianna.
All right, Manu Raju on the Hill for us. Thank you. And in Michael Cohen's open testimony, there were many threads, including this exchange about the president's refusal to release his tax returns.
Can you give us any insight into what the real reason is that the president has refused to release his tax returns?
Statements that he had said to me was that what he didn't want was to have an entire group of think tanks that are tax experts run through his tax return and start ripping it to pieces, and then he'll end up in an audit and he'll ultimately have taxable consequences, penalties, and so on.
So that's an interesting point, that basically he said he didn't want to release his tax returns because he might end up in an audit. So could you presume from that statement that he wasn't under audit?
I presume that he's not under audit.
That was an exchange with California Congressman Jimmy Gomez, who joins us now to talk about this. So you are, as you pointed out, the only member of the Oversight Committee who's also on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the very powerful tax writing committee, and where the chairman has the power to get, or at least request, tax returns. So when Michael Cohen said what he said yesterday about the president's tax return, what did you think?
You know, it was a big deal. I think it really told the American people that every excuse that the president had for not releasing his tax returns was just a complete lie. And if you really look and listen to what Cohen said, he said that potential tax penalties, and you only have tax penalties if you cheated on your taxes or you committed some kind of fraud. So I think it helps set up the request and provide some justification that the chairman needs to request President Trump's tax returns.
So there gives a reason for asking, which would be an investigation. And in that case, as you look at the tea leaves here with what Michael Cohen said, with what the tax returns could show, do you think that the president could be prosecuted for tax fraud or for bank fraud or for insurance fraud if what Michael Cohen said can be corroborated?
You know, one of the things we need to do is really kind of get more information. We need to take the financial statements that Cohen released yesterday, and we need to compare those to the tax returns that the president has filed, and then see if there's any discrepancies. Also, I would love to kind of compare what those tax returns what Cohen has in his, because there should also be some discrepancies. So we'll be setting the foundation to get those tax returns. We got to be careful. We don't want to make this go the wrong way. Listen. If I was running for president, I would release my tax returns. All you're going to find is that I owe $55,000 in student loan debt. I'm one of the poorest members of Congress. But hey, when you're running for the highest position in the land, that's something you should do.
Okay, so the president's obviously are much more complicated, of course, with his business interests, we should point out. And Michael Cohen said that. He said that there are many, many pages, right? This is a big tax return. He's seen it. He didn't pour through it, he said. Michael Cohen brought up the president's family a few times. You know, he talked about Donald Jr. quite a bit. Do you think that your committee needs to hear from Don Jr. or Ivanka Trump or even Alan Weisselberg?
I think Alan Weisselberg is a key component. Eric Trump, Donald Jr., and Ivanka, I'm not sure what we'll get from them, but they all play a role in the family, and this is like any kind of organization where you have a lot of family individuals involved. They all have different positions and information. I'd love to hear some of the information they have, but Alan Weisselberg is probably the key person that we should all hear from, not only here in Congress, but the American people.
Would you want, I mean, one of the things Michael Cohen said yesterday was that he saw Donald Jr. walk behind his father's desk, which was odd, and tell him something to the effect of like it's set up or the meeting's set up, and that he was sort of trying to say something somewhat secretively to his father. Would you want to hear about that from Donald Jr., or do you think that do you think it's pointless to talk to Donald Jr. about that?
Listen, I would love to hear from Donald Jr. in my capacity on the Oversight Committee. Ways and Means is a little bit different, but personally, I think the American people have a lot of questions from what occurred yesterday. A lot of the statements that Trump made during the campaign have proven to be false. A lot of the statements when he made on his payments to Stormy Daniels have proven to be false. So I think the American people, a lot of my constituents, want to hear the truth. And that's what the Democrats are trying to get down to, is the truth. What is the bottom line, and why does Donald Trump not want his tax returns revealed? And one of the things I want people to know, the tax issue is always what gets people in the end. It's not a crime, it's the taxes and the evasion of paying taxes.
Do you think after that hearing yesterday with Michael Cohen that you or your colleagues would be leaning harder into impeachment?
Impeachment's a different matter, but I want to make sure that we do get more information regarding his taxes. What his role when Trump's role when it comes to the Trump Tower meeting, when it came to the building of a Trump Tower in Moscow, when it comes to loans to Deutsche Bank. All those questions raise more red flags than anything else. And if Donald Trump wants to set himself have a clean slate and prove to the American people that he has nothing to hide, he should release his tax returns.
All right, Congressman Gomez, thank you so much for being on with us.
Thank you so much.
We are still digesting the bombshells that came out of Michael Cohen's testimony yesterday. Many times it sounded more like a mob trial than a Capitol Hill hearing.
Mr. Trump called me a rat for choosing to tell the truth, much like a mobster would do when one of his men decides to cooperate with the government.
Have you ever seen Mr. Trump personally threaten people with physical harm?
No. He would use others. He doesn't give you questions. He doesn't give you orders. He speaks in a code. And I understand the code because I've been around him for a decade.
How many times did Mr. Trump ask you to threaten an individual or entity on his behalf?
Quite a few times.
50 times?
More.
100 times?
More.
200 times?
More.
500 times?
Probably. Everybody's job at the Trump Organization is to protect Mr. Trump. Every day, most of us knew we were coming in and we were going to lie for him on something.
Laura Coates is a former federal prosecutor. Dana Bash, CNN chief political correspondent, with us as well. This was one of the more interesting parts. There were so many, honestly, but this was interesting. This idea of he didn't tell me what to do, but I knew what I needed to do. What did you think?
I thought the way that you introduced it was right on, that it did sound sometimes more like a mob trial than talking with a former fixer of the President of the United States, because of those kinds of answers, and also, more importantly, beyond the way that he communicated with people close to him, the allegations that Michael Cohen was bringing forward. We have been so understandably focused on Robert Mueller and on Russia, and also been talking about the things percolating in the Southern District of New York. But if you look at some of the allegations that he has going on here after that, tax crimes, insurance fraud, obstruction, suborning perjury, illegal use of a charity, and that's not even listing all of the allegations that he put forward yesterday. I mean, it's almost hard for the committee to even begin to drill down on, because there's so much, the volume is so high.
How do you see the president's legal exposure? I mean, Dana's rattling things off here.
I mean, think about it. Even if he went like 0 for 6, there's 18 different investigations into this president, his foundation, his organization, some role, even aside from Mueller. So you have that really important thing. This is kind of that bookend. You have the rock and the hard place. Certainly one of those is going to be Mueller probe, but this is a really big deal. As a prosecutor, though, it made it a harder case, because you're always grappling with whether Cohen was a yes man, as in he followed a direct, explicit order, or was he a people pleaser, where I just gleaned from a glance or a pregnant pause and thought, oh, I know what you want me to do. If you're a yes man and there's an order and an explicit directive, I have an evidentiary hook to hang my hat on. If you are a people pleaser who tries to deduce from our conversation what you want, I don't have that direct connection. And so it's a harder case. Having said your point, though, mob trials are often tried on that circumstantial evidence of other corroboration, other things that say, based on that implicit understanding, I acted, and I was either praised for it, or I received some sort of payment for it, or maybe 11 installments of $35,000 to confirm that I knew what the deal was. So it's a harder case, and what he did was really signify in many ways that the way he conducted his business, if to be believed, is somebody who operated on innuendo, explicit orders. But as a prosecutor, it's a harder sell.
But that's if there is no corroborating evidence, right? And I mean, if you're talking about things like his charity, the application he put in for a loan from Deutsche Bank, there should be
the actual personal check of $35,000.
Well, then there's that, right? I mean, but there should be paperwork, documentation, in theory, to corroborate.
And here's why you know there is, because if you're Robert Mueller and you already know you're using somebody as a cooperator to say, they've lied to Congress.
They're not
known
taking Michael
liar.
Cohen's word for it.
Exactly.
We've long said
it's not a pinky swear.
He does have a credibility issue, but he also had reason to tell the truth yesterday, as so many people have pointed out. So the chairman of the committee, Elijah Cummings, he says there's so much material to go through now, they're going to have to coordinate between 5 or 6 committees.
Yeah. And, well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's really, it's hard to imagine how much they have to go through, and that, you know, if you kind of take a step back, it's not like this stuff wasn't out there for the past 2 years. This is one of the benefits and one of the burdens of having an opposition party in the majority. One thing, though, that I have been listening for very carefully is the I word, impeachment. And from everything that I've heard, both on air and in conversations I've been having with House Democrats, they're not going there yet. They're focused on what you just said, Elijah Cummings, that committee, other committees, digging in, trying to get more, and they don't want to even talk about impeachment quite yet, perhaps not ever, because they understand the rock and the hard place. You're talking about that legally. It's even maybe more so politically.
All right, Laura Coates, Dana Bash, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
One of the more stunning moments from the hearing, the claims of racism, after a Republican used a black Trump employee to defend the president. Plus, the other major story, no deal. President Trump walking away from his talks with Kim Jong-un, and we're now learning what advisors warned him against. And one Republican senator calls it reprehensible, the president giving Kim cover on the death of an American citizen. Event. North Korea's foreign minister holding a late-night press conference. This is something that just hardly ever happens. And this is what was said, that North Korea only wanted, quote, partial lifting of sanctions. Now, this is contrary to President Trump citing the lifting of full sanctions. And this is something that is really extraordinary, as the president has walked away from this summit without anything, really, without a deal, lowering some of the expectations going into it. We have former senior advisor at the State Department during the George W. Bush administration and a visiting professor at Georgetown University, Balbina Huang, and CNN Global Affairs analyst and staff writer for The New Yorker, Susan Glasser. Okay, so this is, I guess my question is, there are many questions left unanswered, right? So, Balbina, when you look at this, the idea that it would be sanctions, the articles of sanctions, according to North Korea, that hamper the economy and the livelihood of our people. What's your take on this?
Oh, that actually does mean full sanctions. I mean, North Korea can parse...
Removal of full sanctions.
Well, that's the point. And that's clearly what North Korea was after. I actually don't think the United States walked away with nothing from the summit. I don't view the summit as a failure at all. I think this was actually the best win outcome possibility for the United States. I'm actually shocked. I was not expecting this of all the possible options. But this is actually, I think, a great outcome for the United States.
And why is that? Is it because walking away and saying, you know, like, no way, this is not something that we're going to stand for, it's just important to make that statement?
Absolutely, and it was critical that President Trump did it face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball with Kim Jong-un. And what's actually quite surprising to me is that President Trump didn't, he actually did it in a very, I think, measured manner, and he didn't come off, flying off the handle, which everybody thought he might because he's distracted with domestic issues at home. And in fact, it was very important to keep this convivial relationship going with Kim Jong-un. Because I think the North Koreans finally understand that this president is going to stick firm to this policy.
Susan, what do you think? And what do you help us read between the lines, if you can, of what North Korea is saying and what they're not saying?
Well, it's an interesting argument. I do think, after the fact, you see a certain relief among people in both parties that President Trump walked away rather than accept a bad deal, which was the concern even among many of the president's own advisors walking into the summit. But, I think clearly that is a little bit of after-the-fact justification. The president himself was looking for a big breakthrough to announce. He said as such. They actually had a signing ceremony scheduled, which they canceled. So it wasn't as though this was the plan all along. This was an embarrassing defeat for the President of the United States on the world stage and a blow to his prestige. And I should also note that to many longtime observers of American foreign policy in the world, the President's words towards Kim Jong-un have been particularly shocking. This is not a matter of diplomatic politesse or niceness. The president has sort of slavishly kowtowed, if you will, to the dictator of North Korea over and over and over again, including in the lead up to this summit. And all those kind words, all that flattery amounted to real embarrassment to the United States.
He does portray himself, Balbina, as a deal maker, and he left without a deal.
Absolutely, and that is what surprised me the most about President Trump just walking away and saying, I could not accept this deal. And so, because I thought he would just turn into a deal no matter what. And my biggest fear...
A bad deal in your...
Yes,
in your
and just give North Korea something and anything. So what I find amazing about this, and again, I'm clearly against the tide here, but I think this was actually an incredible victory I think the issue is we are misdefining what the original goals were going into this summit. Everybody thinks it was about just denuclearization, and President Trump had moved himself away from that goal, actually already in Singapore. So this brings us back.
What's to be had?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I got to throw the flag a little bit here. The President of the United States went publicly and told the country and the world and repeated it in writing and said it over and over and over again that in Singapore there was no more nuclear threat as a result of the negotiation that he had achieved. That was not misleading, and he put his own staff in an impossible position of having to negotiate after the fact a deal that he already claimed to have achieved. He didn't claim that. In fact, just a few weeks ago, they were threatening to fire the Director of National Intelligence for testifying accurately that the conclusion of U.S. intelligence agencies was that, in fact, the Kim regime was not prepared to give up its nuclear weapons, which, as we saw in these failed negotiations, was exactly the case. The president didn't accept that finding and wanted to fire his own intelligence director as a result of it.
I completely agree with you and your analysis, and I was in agreement with you. That's precisely my point. He had undermined his own process right up until he walked out of that summit. That is why I am claiming that this summit outcome is actually a very positive win, because what President Trump has finally done is turned it back on the track that it originally was and supposed to be. And in fact, now, what President Trump managed to do, which I actually thought was impossible, because Singapore had set the stage for the wrong path. He finally managed to put the ball back into North Korea's court.
Just final word here, Susan. Do you think the ball's heading in the direction it should be now, to borrow whatever sports analogy we're using?
Well, look, I do. I'm not going to go with the metaphor, but yeah. I think it's an important point, and I do agree that everybody seems relieved in a way, whether you attribute it to conscious action on President Trump's part or simply, being dealt bad hand in these 2 days of negotiations. But either way, I do think it's fair to say that North Korea experts, that American foreign policy experts, many Republicans and many Democrats are relieved that President Trump chose not to take a bad deal here in Singapore. Here in Vietnam. What comes next? Obviously, we don't know.
Susan Glasser, Balpina Huang, thank you so much. But it's always a good conversation when everyone does not agree. I will say I enjoyed that. Coming up, a Republican lawmaker attempting to prove that Trump is not a racist, sparking a bitter back and forth.
The fact that someone would actually use a prop, a black woman, in this chamber, in this committee, is alone racist in itself.
Mr. Chairman,
Trump is setting a precedent.
Mr. Chairman.
And taking Kim Jong-un at his word, the president causing bipartisan outrage by giving the North Korean leader cover in the death of an American colleague. It started when Michael Cohen labeled President Trump a racist. The comment by the president's former fixer came during his testimony before a House committee, and it set off an explosive chain of events. Republican Congressman Mark Meadows responded by introducing an African-American woman, Lynn Patton, who works for the Trump administration and used to work for the Trump family as an event planner, and also was vice president of the Eric Trump Foundation.
She says that as a daughter of a man born in Birmingham, Alabama, that there is no way that she would work for an individual who was racist.
That set off a testy exchange between Meadows and Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
The fact that someone would actually use a prop, a black woman, in this chamber, in this committee, is alone racist in itself. Donald Trump is setting a precedent.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that her words be taken down.
President, I reclaim my time.
Mr.
Donald
Chairman,
Trump is setting a precedent.
Mr.
That
Chairman,
the highest office can be attained.
Mr. Chairman, the rules are clear.
Hillary Shelton is director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau. He's with us now. What did you think, Mr. Shelton, as you saw this?
It was such a distraction. The issues going on at the time was testimony from the president's former lawyer, someone that's been close to the president and his family for years and years.
You mean Congressman Meadows having Lynn Patton, that was a distraction, or this back and forth? Okay, that was a distraction. The back and forth with Lynn Meadows and so forth. I appreciate what the Congresswoman said in response to those issues. Yeah. She's right on target in so many ways. And that was lifting someone up to say that because you knew one black person that worked for the organization, that somehow or another you're not racist, even after looking at other evidence more specifically to the issue. Quite frankly, perhaps we need to begin a conversation where it actually is the definition of racism. And what we'll see is we're thinking about racial prejudice plus power. It's been one of the most effective definitions. When you speak to this issue about someone that worked for him at the level that they did, as we're talking about the woman who stood up behind him as a prop, as we think about the issues of President Trump prior to becoming president, those issues of the discriminatory treatment of those in some of his apartment buildings that have been very well known, become public as we went through this process, as we think about the things that he said and the dog whistles that he's created between some of the most extreme racists in our country, including hate groups and other white nationalist organizations, if we think about issues in those terms and the real facts, they're very much a part of the experiences of Donald Trump. It's a very different conversation. It's simply a distraction. You saw how offended Congressman Meadows was, and he got very emotional, too. He insisted he wasn't a racist. He said he has nieces and nephews who are people of color. He said that he was very good friends. He sort of seemed to be looking for a lifeline from Elijah Cummings, the chairman, who did grant him one, I will say. But he also, as it turns out, said this about President Obama back in 2012.
The more we find out, the more we realize how wrong the direction we're going. And so what we're going to do is take back our country. 2012 is the time that we're going to send Mr. Obama home to Kenya or wherever it is. We're going to do it.
When you look at that and you look at what he has said, do you feel like he can accurately say he is not racist?
I wouldn't want to get into an argument about calling someone a name like racist. But if you ask me if the things he said, both at the hearing and the things he said on the campaign trail, were racist statements, the short answer is yes.
Why is there such a distinction if someone has said or done repeated things that you deem racist to not say that they're racist? You clearly think it's an important distinction. Why?
Well, only because I don't want to get into the art or process of reading someone's heart or mind. Whether they heard something that was confusing that happens to be racist, which could be very well the case here. But the most important thing is the facts. The facts of the matter are what he did when he held that African-American woman up simply because she'd had a job with Donald Trump.
Well, she still has one.
Exactly. But suggesting even under those circumstances that means that Donald Trump is not a racist is really flawed evidence from the very beginning. If you're looking at someone that says something like the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, somehow doesn't belong in this country and should be kicked out because his father happened to be a nationalist from one of the countries in Africa, though we know his mother was born in Kansas and we know what the laws are of the land, even written to our Constitution, as to how one becomes a citizen of the United States. But to carry out those kind of things as Donald Trump did, quite frankly, is using his power in a very discriminatory manner to have an ill effect on someone else. And in this case, as we're talking about this matter, we're talking about President Barack Obama.
Thank you so much. Hillary Shelton with the NAACP. Thank you for coming into the studio. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's an honor to be here.
And coming up, Michael Cohen accusing the president of criminal conduct while in office. So what is the potential fallout for the president? We're going to talk to one lawmaker whose committee just interviewed Cohen behind closed doors. And the president praising Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for doing a great job. As a source tells CNN, Netanyahu is going to be indicted on bribery and breach of trust charges. Over the death of American student Otto Warmbier. The president says he believes the North Korean leader did not know about the circumstances leading up to Warmbier's death.
He felt badly about it. I did speak to him. He felt very badly. He knew the case very well, but he knew it later. And, you know, you got a lot of people, a big country, a lot of people. And in those prisons and those camps, you have a lot of people. And some really bad things happened to Otto. Some really, really bad things.
Why are you?
But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
Warmbier went to North Korea on an educational trip. He was imprisoned by the regime, and he later died just days after North Korea returned him to the U.S. in a vegetative state. Now, during the 2018 State of the Union address, with Warmbier's parents in the audience, the president blasted the, quote, depraved character of Kim's regime, adding Warmbier's story was a warning to all about the, quote, menace that threatens our world, end quote. We have independent Maine Senator Angus King with us on Capitol Hill. You serve, sir, on the Armed Services Committee. You're watching this certainly very closely. What was your reaction to the president commenting on Otto Warmbier? And I would like to remind people what his parents said had happened to him. They say when he was returned, he was blind, deaf. His arms and legs were, quote, totally deformed. They say he had a huge scar on his foot. And they said, his dad said, quote, it looked like someone had taken a pair of pliers and rearranged his bottom teeth. Do you find it hard to believe that Kim Jong-un wouldn't have known about this?
Totally hard to believe. The president was right a year ago and wrong today.
I don't know why in the world he would take the word of a dictator for something like this, particularly a country that's under such tight control. It doesn't pass the straight face test that Kim Jong-un didn't know exactly what was going on with this young man, a high-profile hostage, an American, and I'm just amazed that the president would say what he did today. And on the other hand, I think he did the right thing by walking away from the summit, but then this was a unforced error. There's no way the dictator of North Korea wouldn't have known exactly what was going on with this young man.
The president has sided with authoritarian leaders before. This is a pattern. Listen to what he said about the leaders of Russia and Saudi Arabia.
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. I hate the crime. I hate what's done. I hate the cover-up. And I will tell you this. The Crown Prince hates it more than I do. And they have vehemently denied it. The CIA points it both ways. As I said, maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
Those were comments about Russian meddling in the 2016 election and also the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a U.S.